Okay, thanks very much, Marta, and thank the whole AAPSS and those who contributed to the selection process and to this event. And I'm deeply humbled and appreciative to be inducted and to be part of this year's incredible group of honorees. So to the question. So I sought to reflect in general and in light of my fellowship's title, Mahatma Gandhi, and I've settled on two answers, one micro and one macro, and I think these ultimately will intersect. The first problem is what we might call tipping points of political violence. In the past 15 years or so, we've come a long way in understanding political violence, examining in particular its strategic logic under certain conditions. We have a better understanding of how and why civil wars start and persist, how and why armed groups use use violence to coerce civilian populations and the entities that support them, how and why violence serves as a form of power, how and why genocide and other forms of mass violence take place, and who participates in violence and how they are recruited. What I think we lack is an understanding of the fluid moments of decision-making that tip people and organizations into violence or that tip them away from it. There's some pioneering microsociological work on the emotional state of forward panic, but that initial work has not been updated or tested rigorously, at least not recently. I think this question occupies me for a number of reasons, and this will pick up on some of what Rogelio spoke about quite eloquently. You know, in ways that I never anticipated, the political violence that I've studied elsewhere feels much closer to home, or at least it's much more imaginable closer to home. We are in a city where opposing the Speaker of the House can draw direct threats to oneself and one's family, and where not long ago, and likely not long from now, messianic demagogues rally violence by invoking the apocalypse. This is not something I contemplated when I started working on violence 20 plus years ago. And yet, violence here is not widespread, or at least not yet widespread. There are bursts and widespread threats, but they have been contained. I think there are, in other words, restraints, both visible and invisible, that limit and contain violence. Why? Why does violence start and why does violence never start? Why does it start and then stop? Why does it start and then escalate? Why does it flare up periodically across the political landscape? Many of our answers to these questions, at least in political science, are structural. Yet we know that violence is dynamic and interactive, subject to contingency, even if propelled by certain forces. And hence the question, how and why does violence manifest at particular moments? And perhaps more importantly, why does it not? The more macro theme, the second theme, is what we might call our global unwinding. Without romanticizing the post-war era from the 1940s to recent years, I think it's fair to say that we are witnessing profound changes to our global order. There is a lot one can put in this category on the political side: the relative decline of the United States and Western Europe, the discrediting of democracy and the rise of autocracy in multiple forms, intensified great power rivalry, regional power plays all across the world, the contestation of borders, and the prospect of interstate wars in ways that we haven't seen in many, many years. I also would include climate change here, picking up on Rogelio's comments, and the upending of the ecological order on which our societies, polities, and economies have been built. I don't know enough to know what the AI revolution will do or how to anticipate the onslaught of disinformation and misinformation that's coming our way, but I think it's fair to say that the political and ecological spheres that we have known for multiple generations are unwinding, or they're at least no longer as they were. I think further, the institutions that we have developed to manage this world seem no longer fit to purpose. I'll defend the United Nations to its detractors. It's an institution for good. But I don't think it's fit to purpose for the world we're facing and is unlikely to adapt to it. I don't mean to be overly pessimistic. I'm certainly clouded by my own bias of studying violence. But apropos our prompt, I think the problem is that these global forces are quite difficult to study from a social science perspective. For one, our conceptual vocabulary is quite limited. We don't have great terms or frameworks to capture this change. Further, our disciplines that are tasked and subfields that are tasked to answer these questions tend to frame them from an American perspective, often unwittingly, and yet we need to be able to see these changes from multiple points across the globe. I think even more generally, political science and related disciplines have become better and better at answering narrower questions with greater precision, and there's a tremendous value in that. And yet we have trouble capturing the macro, slow-moving structural changes and the dynamics that they are unleashing. These are harder to isolate, harder to compare, harder to generate causal leverage on, and ultimately harder to understand. So to close, I hope that students, colleagues, and I can address these problems that if we can understand better might help us to limit violence, disorder, and war, which I think Gandhi and the ideas that he stood for stood against. So thanks so much. Yeah.